My name's Jeff, and this is my 71 Ford Bronco. And today we're going to replace the stock 9-inch rear end with a Currie F9 fabricated housing rear end. We've had a lot of bearing failures with our rear end because we've upgraded to a stroker motor with 435 foot-pounds of torque, and we have 35-inch tires, which is way overkill for what the stock rear end was designed to do. Our ultimate goal is to tow our trailer to our favorite off-roading spot, beat the crap out of the Bronco all weekend, and then tow the trailer home with no issues. So a new rear end is a must. Okay, here's the Currie F9 rear end that we're going to put in the Bronco. I really like this rear end because it's got a lot more ground clearance than a stock 9-inch, so my ability to get over rocks is going to be a lot easier without hanging up. The other thing about this rear end that's really nice is that it's been proven in a lot of racing series. So for example, I've seen it on cars at the King of the Hammers, I've seen it on cars at short car races around town, and I've also seen it out in the desert on pre-runners and other desert race trucks. To make sure that we don't have any more wheel bearing failures, I wanted to upgrade to even larger bearings than what was recommended. So we went with huge military spec set 80 bearings, and then we also upgraded to JK rear disc brakes that'll allow us to manage our big tires better. As you can see, this housing is just tacked into place. Currie recommends that if you can, to take the rear end home and actually place it in the vehicle and make sure that everything fits correctly. For us, this is really important because an early Bronco with aftermarket brakes, the shock mount lines up right in the wrong spot. So this will give us an opportunity to make sure that the shock mount lines up correctly, and then also we can adjust our pinion angle to make sure that gets lined up correctly as well. Let's get underneath and get started. Okay, we got the F9 rear end set in place. Now we don't have any pressure on the springs, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to center this rear end. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to measure from the flange to the leaf spring on both sides, and we're going to match that measurement. And once that measurement equals the same on both sides, then we know we got it centered. Now that we have our rear end centered, we're going to adjust the pinion angle. Now the way we're going to do that is I'm going to get underneath, and we're actually going to twist the rear end around to get it to line up at the same angle as the drive shaft. Now on the rear end of a Bronco, because I have leaf springs, under load it'll actually give a little bit, so the rear end will come up about 2 degrees. So I'm going to drop the rear end angle down about 2 degrees below the drive shaft angle, so under load it comes up and it's nice and even. That way during normal highway driving I don't have any vibrations and it'll ride nice. Other vehicles that aren't Broncos or that don't have leaf springs may act differently, so if you have a different type of vehicle and you're installing one of these rear ends, you may want to check with someone that knows that type of suspension to find out exactly what pinion angle you need to have. Okay, now we have our pinion angle set. Before anything changes, I want to get these spring mounts tacked into place. Once we get the spring mounts tacked into place, then we'll go back and we'll measure our shock mounts, make sure they clear the brakes, which we'll show you in a minute, and then we'll tack those in place. Once that's done, we're done. We can send it off to Currie and the rest of the work can be done with them. Okay, now we have our spring pads mounted, tacked in place, and we have this JK rear brake setup, half of it anyways, put in place as well. Now the purpose of mounting this onto the end of the housing is to make sure that our shock will clear the caliper. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the measurement off the old rear end, we're going to match it to this rear end, and we're going to hope that it matches up and everything works okay and there's no clearance issues. If not, then what we'll do is we'll move the shock mount in a little bit until we clear the caliper, and then we'll tack that in place as well. Alright, we got the rear end out of the Bronco, in the truck, we got the spring mounts tacked in, we got the shock mounts tacked in, and now we're going to take it over to Currie and they're going to weld everything up, straightened out, and basically show us from start to finish what it takes to build one of these rear ends. So let's head on over there and see what they got to show us. Okay, we're over here at Currie with the F9 rear end. I got everything tacked up and ready to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it off the truck, pull the mock-up third member out, and then bring it into the welding shop, and they're going to weld up everything inside and then finish the whole thing up today. Probably the most important feature of the Currie F9 housing is the fact that they mill a flat into the axle tube, and that gets keyed into the bulkhead of the housing center. That makes it really strong and kind of sets it apart from most of the other housings out on the market today. The next step in the process is to drill the hole for the vent tube. What they do is they place it in a special made fixture to get the angle just right. What's really cool about this setup in the F9 housing is that they drill the hole on the outside of the bulkhead, which allows ventilation, but it also limits the amount of oil that comes up towards the vent tube, limiting the amount of oil that could potentially come out of the rear end and drip on the floor. Now that the axle tubes have been machined, we brought them over to the main tacking area. What happens here is the axle tubes will be keyed into the housing center and tacked, and also the housing ends will be tacked on to the end of the axle tubes. Now that we're at Currie's welding shop, we're going to take our tacked together F9 housing and turn it into a fully welded unit. There's a couple steps that are really important that set the F9 rear end apart from other rear ends in the market. The first part is that they weld the axle tubes to the bulkhead. The second part is that they weld the axle tubes to the outside of the housing center. That creates a really strong unit. Once that's done, we're going to take it outside, we're going to put a pre-bend in it, and then we're going to weld the back braces to it, which is going to straighten the housing back out, and then bring it back in and weld everything else up. As we were watching our rear end being built, I realized that there's a lot more to this than what I even expected. What's happening here is now that he has the back braces fitted, he has to do a lot of work to make sure that the U-bolts that bolted onto the rear end fit. So what they do is they take these brackets and modify them, weld them to the back braces, and then also drill through the back braces so that the U-bolts can come up through and be attached to the leaf springs. This is a really time-consuming process, and it's going to be nice when it's all done.
After everything is welded, the housing ends are broken loose and realigned true to the housing center line. They are also clocked for optimum caliper position based on our application.
This is our completed F9 housing. As you've seen, there's a huge process that takes place to get it to this point. Between the MIG welders, the TIG welders, applying the back braces, fabricating for the U-bolts, adding the housing ends, welding the axle tubes into the bulkhead. It's a huge process, but when it's all done, it looks like this. And this is not only one of the strongest, if not the strongest rear end available, but it also looks really cool too. Now that our F9 housing is done, it's time to assemble the third member. Here are all the parts that go into a third member. 35 spline locker,
our Currie 9 Plus gear case, yoke, and pinion support, our 456 ring and pinion set, and all the bolts, seals, and bearings that go in to make this thing complete. Let's take a step back and watch a Currie craftsman put the whole thing together. Our housing's complete, our third member's complete, and the next step before we can assemble is to get our axles done. This here is a bare axle forging. There's no splines, there's no bearings attached, there's nothing drilled for the wheel studs. It's just a bare forging. So what we're going to do is go through the process of turning it into this, which is a 35 spline, fully assembled axle, has our bearing retainer plate, our bearings, our wheel studs, all ready to go in. So let's take a look at how that process goes. We have our F9 housing completed, we have our third member put together, we have our axles assembled, and now we're going to put everything into the housing and have a complete rear end. To do this, we're going to start with the third member and place it into the housing. Then we have the backing plates, the axles, the rotors, calipers. All right, here it is, our completed F9 Currie rear end. As you can see, everything's attached, everything's done. We got our JK brakes. Looks awesome, looks really good. A couple things that Currie did that I didn't know they were gonna do is they add a little magnet to the bottom of the inside of the housing center. What that does is if there's any debris, any extra metal flake, it'll just catch that, kind of act like a filter. And then also, on these third member studs, they put little lock nuts on the inside, just to make sure that those studs don't pop out. You know, it's those little extra features that make it a really nice piece. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna load it up, we're gonna take it back to the house, I'm gonna throw a coat of black paint on it, for my liking, and we'll throw it in the Bronco.
As you can see, we got our F9 rear end installed in the Bronco. Before we were able to do this, we had to do a couple extra steps to make sure everything was coordinated correctly. Installing the JK brakes requires that we had to weld a bracket on for the brake line and also a bracket on for the brake hose. So we had to mock the rear end back up really quick, tie those two brackets together, take it out, then we sprayed it, and we were able to install it basically the opposite way of how it came out. Now it's really important on these rear ends when you put them back in that you get the brakes bled completely and properly. If you don't know how to do this, just take it to a mechanic and get it done right. The final steps in preparing your rear end to drive are to make sure you add oil. Currie recommends our 9 Plus racing oil, and that's the gear oil we chose. Also, you want to make sure that you break in your rear end as per Currie specs. So check with them and make sure you do it right. One last thing to consider is that when you upgrade to JK brakes, you also have to run 17-inch rims. We had 15-inch rims before, so we upgraded to new trail-ready beadlock rims and BFG mud terrain 37-inch tires. Just like the F9 rear end, these wheels and tires are rated for heavy-duty off-road use, and we know that it's going to be perfect for our application. Thanks again for watching. Now I'm going to go find some rocks.